Hello and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted, and I mean truly delighted, to welcome back friend and supporter of AXSChat, Paul Smyth, who's head of accessibility at Barclays Access. Paul, it's great to see you again. Actually, you've got several other hats that you're also wearing. Um, one of which, of course, is co-chair of the Business Disability Forum's Technology Taskforce, but you're also the Disability Sector Champion for Web Accessibility for the UK Government. And this is particularly pertinent because this Monday, new legislation came into effect around public sector web accessibility. So how can we put this in layman's terms about what it is, and of course, give us a bit of a heads up about what you're doing, and how you came to be in this role.
Sure, great. Well, thanks, Neil, and hi. Nice to be back with a fantastic trio of it is AXSChat. I was thinking about this, and this is my third time back, and I'm sort of wowed of how the AXSChat community has kind of grown strength to strength. So first off, big thanks for you folks and the consistency and continuity to keep running this, for the awesome speakers you get when I look back and sort of listen in on some of the sessions you've had in recent weeks, and just for the kind of encouragement and the conversations that happen. You're right, Neil. This week marks a bit of a major milestone for the UK and Europe. We've got this new accessibility regulations landing, and I kind of wanted to make sure that everyone's got a clear understanding of what it is and what it means. And I guess for me, this has been worked on the last 3 years or so. What's changed this week is it means any newly built public sector website needs to be accessible. In another year or so, it means all public sector websites need to be accessible. And in 2 years from now, it means all public sector mobile apps need to be accessible. So breaking this down, this is your local government or council website. It's about university and colleges and so forth. It's about publicly funded charities. So it's great to see this added requirement coming in saying, thou shalt build accessible digital services. And I think just to sort of break it down, what it means is if you work in a public sector organisation, your websites are actually intranets and colleague systems. You need to sort of, 1, do an accessibility check of them. 2, you need to be able to understand what things are broken and explain that in a clear, practical, plain English way. And you need to kind of package that as an accessibility standard on your website, saying kind of, here's what we've checked, whether we're partially or fully, compliant, and importantly, how to contact us if you've got feedback and suggestions. So it's a great opportunity to actually engage the community of users with access needs. So, incredible that it's landed now in UK and Europe. I know with my hat on, working as a sector champion for UK government, really pleased to see too that, again, it's being monitored in terms of compliance. In the UK, it's our Government Digital Services, or GDS friends, who will be, over the coming weeks, monitoring, thousands of sites and figuring out, who's got a statement, who's accessible. Clearly, there will be a transition because we know that many public sector websites aren't there yet. But, it's fantastic to see that there's a bit more legislation with teeth coming in, and it's making it easier for people to give feedback too. So really exciting.
I mean, so there are a couple of points that I think are really interesting. So firstly, the element around public funding. So if the website is publicly funded, it's in scope. So if it has public funding, it's in scope, which I think was news to some people. And I think that also the fact that in the UK legislation they have clearly linked it back to the Equality Act. So a failure to deliver web accessibility under this legislation is then considered by GDS to be a breach of the Equality Act. Really gives that law some teeth, because if people weren't aware, the Equality Act, the breach of the Equality Act, those fines are uncapped. So suddenly it sort of brings stuff into quite clear focus, and what the Equality Act didn't have, was any clarity over guidelines and how you should comply or anything else. So this is actually quite a significant piece of legislation because it's really putting into place clear guidance upon, at least for some part of disability and inclusion, for some part of accessibility, what it is required for you to do in order to not exclude people and to comply. So I think this is a a significant moment in web accessibility in the UK and across Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess relating it back to the community of AXSChat and accessibility professionals, what that means is there's lots of organisations running around scratching their heads thinking that we didn't fully understand this. There's lots more clarity, legislation of what's expected, what you need to do. So you can imagine, lots more people looking out for, accessibility experts and agencies and groups that they need to work with to make sure that their digital services are up to scratch. So, again, it's really useful just to make sure that everyone's really clear on sort of what's changing. And I think it's useful that this is on the supply side. So, government monitoring and encouraging. And I'll certainly share some sort of links in the Twitter chat of some great guidance and resources that are there to help organisations to make sure they're getting more accessible. But I think the other thing I've been looking at too is really about the demand side and how can customers say when things are sort of broken. We look at our friends, Debra in the US, and lots more being consumer-led, saying when things aren't broken. But we don't really have that here in the UK. And, again, with my sort of government hat on, been doing some work looking at how do customers complain? We know this stat that gets trotted out. I think for every 10 disabled users encountering a barrier online, only one of the 10 will bother complaining. The other 9 will just give up and walk away because it's too difficult, too frustrating. They don't think they're getting heard. And I think what this new legislation does is it makes it really clear and simple with kind of a clear disability help pages and who to contact. And one of the things I've done working with all the major disability charities is create some better guidance to help individuals. So say if you are having an issue with visually impaired Paul can't get my bin collected and I go to the council site and it doesn't work for me, then I can, contact them and say what's broken and, ask them to sort of fix it. If I'm not getting anywhere, then, I can sort of escalate to them, to their chief exec as a formal complaints. I mean, if it's still not working, there's kind of a clear ombudsman. In the UK, we call it the Equality Advisory Support Service, which is kind of part of the people who kind of run the Equality Acts of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. But it's just sort of really important to know that there is those kind of steps of, work through with the organisation, more formally complain to the organisation, and if it's not working, take it up with the right government ombudsman. So, really keen to kind of spread the word on how that works and make it as easy as possible for people encountering sort of barriers to make sure that they're contacting and complaining to the right places to make positive change.
Excellent. And that whole clarity is really important because I think lots of smaller publicly funded organizations are definitely going to be approaching this afresh, maybe for the first time. There is a part around disproportionate burden, as there always is with new legislation. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is considered, what the sort of general sort of guidance is around for small organizations that are publicly funded as to, where it's appropriate for them to say, actually, it's going to take us a little bit more time to get stuff in place. Is there guidance on that at the moment?
Yeah, there certainly is. I'm not giving legal advice on this.
Sure,
I should
understood.
Say.
Understood.
But what it really sort of gets to is, if you're a large public sector organisation and lots of people are using your site and there's no other way they can do a thing, maybe it's renewing a passport, for example, then there's an expectation that you really need to make that service, that particular journey on your site accessible. So it is about looking at what the task is that people are coming to your site to do, what parts of your sites are more important than others. So if you're a college or university, is it a teacher area or a student area, for example? And really what disproportionate burden's getting at is if I'm a local government council, maybe I don't really have any web development people, and maybe all of that is outsourced to a digital agency. And if I ask them to make my site accessible, they say it's going to cost, X million pounds, and we simply just don't have that funding in government at the moment. So again, it's taking into account all of those things in terms of this, the size of the organisation, the importance of the digital service and presence they have, and who actually builds it and owns it and controls it.
Yeah. So I think that's Debra, did you want to comment? Because I think there are some similarities in the US.
Well, all I would say, and I think Antonio wanted to comment, but I'll just make a real quick comment, in that we, in the United States, we call that undue burden. And what's interesting is if you select the undue burden as a government agency, it actually will flag you. So it is reported to our Congress and Senate. So it's a pretty big deal to do an undue burden. And most of our agencies, unless it is a privacy or security undue burden, they won't do it. But I know that Antonio wanted to make a comment too. But bravo to you guys for doing this.
Paul, this is the third time that we met, like you have mentioned before. A lot of things have changed in the world of accessibility, even in our own personal lives. It's basically a permanent process of change. So, but in reality, what is actually new in Barclays? What is keeping your accessibility team busy?
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. And oh gosh, yeah, there's quite a lot when I think of like the last year or two. Like I say, we're still, trying to do lots externally and me for that matter. So whether it's with the Business Disability Forum in the UK, whether it's sort of contributing and writing sort of guidance for the W3C, and supporting the UK government, just to make sure we spread the word on accessibility. But gosh, when I think about Barclays, huge amount of change happening. I think as we're doing more digital things, there's more projects and people coming through that need our help of how do we consider and deliver accessibility? How do we build a great experience for a greater number of people? It feels like we've just been running to keep still. We've had sort of WCAG 2.1 for the techie folks, understand that sort of bigger things to kind of check and consider as we're building out and shipping new things. We've had specific bank regulations looking at vulnerable customers that we're still looking at. So not just the impact of customers that might have disability and mental health conditions, but what about if you're financially vulnerable? What about financial and emotional resilience? So death, divorce, and so forth. And it's a really interesting area to understand how we need to better serve those customers, how our digital services need to maybe adapt to those customers. So you get a sense, that changing our accessibility practices to deal with the huge amount of projects coming through as we're trying to mandate and mainstream accessibility, using powerful accessibility tools. And, I have to sort of tip my hat to the likes of sort of DQ and, their AX engine sort of making lives easier. And also in recent months, Microsoft and the Microsoft Accessibility Insights tool, amongst others, that, make this really easy when you're a small accessibility team, and many organizations, there might just be one person, trying to get a whole army of digital people to build things in an accessible way, can be quite tough. So again, there's far better and powerful tooling out there. There's a huge amount of my team's time looking at training and how do we provide really quality training about accessibility, need to knows and do's. And I guess when I think about products, we do a huge amount of disabled user testing to make sure that, our main Barclays websites, the apps, the cash machines do truly work for everyone. And maybe to give you an example, when I think about the new features we're building in, like being able to take a picture of your smartphone of a paper check and have it processed and paid instantly into your bank account, it's convenient for many of us, but it could be transformational for some of us who couldn't get to the bank branch. So again, we go to great pains to do a lot of disabled user testing and consultation when we see some of these new features being launched that we think are actually of arguably sort of most benefits to people with sort of particular impairments. Same thing with video banking, for example, and making sure, not just, we think it might work if people are reliant on lip reading, but, really sort of making sure of that. So yeah, all in all, lots about new ways of working, lots about new products, looking at this whole sort of vulnerability, and sometimes rather than an online retailer trying to make things super simple, you think of Amazons and so forth, and making it really easy for people to find a product and put it in their cart and pay for it. In the sort of banking world, sometimes we have to sort of add vulnerability back in, for certain segments, for example. So, that's been a really interesting and creative challenge to look at. And just again, the sort of training and tools. So yeah, lots going on internally. And when I sort of step back and think about the community, I've mentioned how proud I am of you folks for the AXSChat community. And even rolling forwards, we've got Inclusive Design 24 coming up to spread the word, the gospel of accessibility externally. In the UK, we've got TechShare Pro in November, and in December, a huge amount of resources, courses that happen to mark International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So it just feels to me like it's a particularly busy time.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm sure Debra, who has been traveling around the world, will be very keen in talking about trends. Back to you, Debra.
Thank you. And before I do that, I do want to just thank you, Paul, and Neil, both as heads of major corporations, major global corporations, because I see y'all contributing everywhere. And I don't always see that across the board. I see you're engaged in the Valuable 500. You're engaged in supporting the IAAP. You're engaged in, Purple Light Up. It's just you're everywhere. You're supporting W3C. You're engaged in so many ways, and the leadership value that you're both bringing is invaluable. And I think that we don't thank you enough. So I definitely want to thank both of you and everybody that's doing the work. Excuse me. And but my question is, what accessibility trends do you see more broadly?
Sure. I mean, I think I've sort of mentioned, a sort of powerful tool. So sometimes it's getting easier to embed accessibility. I mean, stepping back though, right, we've seen more laws come in recent months. So whether it's Canada, whether it's in UK and Europe, as we've talked about, so there's more kind of what's demanded by law. We're seeing more lawsuits as well, right? So whether it's for US and Domino's Pizza or wherever else. And that's great that, what's required legally is really clearing up, and of course we've got user expectations as people fiddle around with their smartphones and make the most of how to make stuff bigger and easier to, hear and understand and use. Again, people's expectations are up now in what they use on their devices and then what they come in and expect in their workplaces, which is really interesting too, to kind of keep on top of that. And it's no surprise with all of this that the interest for organizations about, oh gosh, we've heard this thing about accessibility, but what do we really need to do? I spend a lot of my time talking to organizations who are kind of waking up to that all this is getting quite important and are now figuring, the sort of second step of where do I start? I mean, I know we've just created a new benchmarking tool, a maturity model with our friends at the Business Disability Forum that Neil and I are part of, which again really helps answer that question. But in answer to the trends, Debra, I think one of the biggest areas that's holding us back is probably language. And, when I reflect on this, I sort of think in recent weeks, we've had 50 years since, putting man on the moon. And I sort of think, well, that was the space race, but if we called it a space agenda, would we have still got there? And I think about, the disability agenda, the accessibility agenda, that, there's not really the same urgency as I see and feel when I speak to customers daily who can't do certain things. So, there's something about the language we use to give a sense of urgency and importance. And I think people here diversity and inclusion, and many of our HR diversity and inclusion colleagues use some of these words, and sometimes it's not always fully understood by the rest of the organization and people they speak to. So just to give you an idea of this, we're now starting to talk about inclusive design in a slightly different way, and it, just to kind of unpack it, it goes like this: that if I was in a room and I asked 100 people there, what does exclusion mean? Everyone kind of knows that it's being left out or left behind. But if I asked 100 people what inclusion means, I get almost 100 different answers. Maybe it's about merit-based hiring without bias, or maybe it's about doing something for everyone, or whatever. So it kind of confuses matters. And when people talk about inclusion, sometimes you must get that kind of glazing over, just not quite getting it, to then get past the next step of what they really need to do. And we've been thinking about this for some time. The way we now approach this, and again, I've spoken to a number of accessibility and inclusive design folks, is we really need a really basic way of how everyone can understand this, because it's not just talking about diverse and inclusive workforces, about creative, productive colleagues and so forth, but actually for the entire organization. And we need to put it in a business speak. So for us, I go back to this numpty example. I think about, imagine you had all your users, a population out there, and quite a lot of them are bunched to the center, the average or normal, whatever we want to call it, based on whatever characteristics we're looking at. It could be disability or age. And if I'm a product designer trying to build something, the way I think about this is I've got like a lasso of inclusion. And what we've always historically done is, this kind of one size fits all approach. We've said, let's say I'm trying to build something like a lift and I'm figuring out where to put the button. I might look at, well, people are so short and they're so tall, so if I put the lift button around this height, it should work for most. And I sort of think about, well, I'm throwing a sort of lasso of inclusion over the sort of people bunched in the center, and those people, my product that I'm building, it works for them, right? But the flip side of that is I'm clearly excluding people, and often many organizations just stop there. So they've considered people's needs, but that's it. And in my mind, the sort of inclusive design is actually making an effort to consult with real world people, sort of one at a time, going around the edges, the fringes, and saying, okay, well, what would I need to do to make this work for you? So maybe there's a super tall person and may need a second button higher up, so I can tweak that to my product and it works for them and works for everyone else. Or maybe there's a wheelchair user and I need to put some crazy proximity sensors and beacons because they don't have the reach, for example, to press the button. So you start to see I'm going around one by one, and my lasso of inclusion starts getting jagged edges because the world is messy and people are different. But it's an important point of going from sort of considering what works for most people to sort of consulting with and asking more for that sort of inclusion. And to break that down, why does this matter? Well, clearly there's people previously excluded can now use and enjoy your product or participate in society. So it's changed them, but it's kind of also changed the person throwing the lasso of inclusion, right? When you do this, you can't unsee exclusion, whether it's, using the, toilets with sensors that aren't great if you're visually impaired to figure out the flush. Maybe it's using the sensors at the bathroom sink that turn on, but maybe that your skin color, they don't work for you because it hasn't been designed. You can see exclusion everywhere. Or maybe it's the spinny doors on corporate offices that work for right-handed people to help them, but if you're left-handed, they kind of hinder you. You don't really stop and sort of think about these things unless it typically impacts you. So I think thinking about inclusive design like this, impacting people previously excluded that can now use your thing, changing yourself. And I guess the third and most important point is it sort of changes society, everyone else using the product because they see these invisible or previously invisible people using your product. So it's kind of a simple idea, but it's really powerful because it goes back to, we are changed from what we have seen and when we are seen. So again, we are changed from what we have seen and when we are seen. So, this idea of really making sure that, when we talk about accessible design, inclusive design, universal design, whatever, but if the idea is about, step one, consider diverse needs of everyone, step two, consult with real world people, and step three, even better still, hire diverse disabled talent who will be far better at throwing that lasso of inclusion, so you have more and more happier customers. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? So I think, some of these concepts of inclusive design, really important to kind of spread.
Great answer. I know that Neil wanted to make a comment. Neil, let me turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. And Paul, I'm with you. When you actually design something that works for the edge, you're actually much more likely to capture the middle anyway. So I'm interested, because I know this is a shared interest, in skills. You talked about you're going out and you're visiting lots of organizations, and yes, we're equipping them with tools, but there's also a need for those organizations to hire people that can help them in their journey to being more accessible. And we know from our own experience that that's actually quite hard to do. So, we're seeing new graduates coming into teams, that they've been trained in how to create applications, but they've not been trained about accessibility. So I'm participating, and I know you are too, in a number of efforts to try and bring those skills into the mainstream. But can you talk a little bit more about how you see this need and what you think we can do to improve things here?
Yeah, sure. And I think, it's no surprise that many sort of large disability confident organizations, we're all sort of building our own library or sort of, training hub of accessibility content and delivering it in sort of, often sort of engaging in memorable ways that people really get a sense of empathy and compassion, right? That our customers come in different shapes and sizes, and that they need to be consciously conscious of what they're building. So I think many organizations start with this sort of accessibility 101, the sort of basics. WCAG, for example, is great about talking what you need to do and how to do it, but not really so good about why you need to do it and who it's for. So sort of injecting that sort of human aspect, having a sort of basic grounding is important. And then having sort of role-based pathways of what designers and developers and testers need to know and do. So we can kind of build that up, but it's really important to think about the best way that we deliver it, the best way that we build champions and communities to support one another. But I think what your point is really getting at is that if we as organizations all do the same thing, we're not really solving the problem. Someone from Barclays, it becomes great accessibility and then they leave, and we get someone new in and we have to sort of teach them. So really getting to the heart of the matter, it's looking at actually university programs, colleges, and when they're teaching computer sciences, design, how can we make sure that accessibility, inclusive design is a kind of a topic, it's a chapter in their textbook, so to speak. And how do we as businesses and organizations help support the educational institutions to bring it to life in a practical way. So I know we are involved in many of those conversations. I know there's global efforts like Teach Access in the US too, but really looking at how can organizations, businesses really help support how people educate, the sort of digital students, the accessibility experts of tomorrow. So yeah, there's still quite a lot of work to do on that front.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we're making some progress. So if people are interested, there is a consultation going on right now around our proposal for an digital accessibility apprenticeship standard in the UK. So please, people, go to the Institute for Apprenticeships website, take a look, give us your comments, give us your feedback. I know that we're also working with the Institute of Coding, and Paul, you and I are both going to be there on Monday, where we've got a number of universities and a number of stakeholders looking how we can inject accessibility into the pedagogy. Yeah, you mentioned Teach Access, and I think that's also really useful. But we've got sort of a duality of needs here. We've got the need for general awareness in our new generation of technologists that are coming through, and then we've got the need for specialism as well. Because I think if we go back to where we started, which was all of these websites need to be accessible. There's an increased monitoring of this stuff. We can see that the demand coming down the track, and we need ways of meeting that demand for being able to assess and fix the issues that we find when we do assess. So I think it's a mixture of things. It's people skills, specialist people, sort of people with skills that are generalists, technology generalists. Mm-hmm. You've got the specialists, and then yes, the automation tools. And if we're to go on to the next stage and look at new technologies, it's like, how can we maybe utilize AI and machine learning more effectively to move from maybe the 20% that we're going through now in automated testing to make that 30, 40, 50%, so that we are removing some of the burden that we face in terms of manual testing, because at the moment you can run automated tools and they are getting better, but there's still an awful lot that requires human intervention to get it right. And then I'm going to hand over to Debra and Antonio. I know they've both got questions, but where do you see this going?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The skills and sort of knowledge you need to be an accessibility guru or Jedi, are quite varied. There's technical skills, there's business skills, there's people skills. And I think it goes back to giving people a grounding in the basics, and then having, the opportunity to kind of branch off based on your kind of skills and interests. The building those pathways are really important. Building the content of what they need to know, and then the best way to deliver that and engage people is really important. And I think the apprentice programs too that you touched on, Neil, it's really important. Again, thinking about how people can kind of transition and get into this industry, right, from a sort of school place to the workplace. It still goes back, right? I'm sure I've said this before, that as accessibility experts, we spend our time removing barriers for disabled people, yet sometimes we construct barriers in how other people get trained in this topic, and we really need to kind of get over that and figure out a better way to do it. So I know, we're always conscious about how can we open source any useful resources and videos that we have internally, if it's not massively specific to Barclays, it hasn't been Barclaysified, then again, we can kind of share that externally, right? And, I'd encourage other organizations to sort of look at what they can do to contribute back to.
Thank you.
Myself and a group of colleagues, and we organize an hackathon in Dublin in the last couple of years, and we often get young developers from different universities in Ireland joining the event, helping to run the event, being part of the teams who are trying to build solutions, and we often get this type of comments. Oh, I didn't know about this. This is quite interesting. I must learn more about how can I develop an accessible app. How can I improve my code? Where can I go to learn more about this? Because nobody has mentioned this before. And I believe that I need to learn more about and develop my skills to be able to do apps that people can actually use. So people get really excited about something that they feel that they need to do. Even if they never came across that during their years in university. So I think that the part of training is particularly relevant, especially for young developers, because I think from the moment that you put that in front of people, they will just adopt, consume, and self-develop.
Yeah, and just real quick on that point, Antonio, it's important that we we train up young eager beaver sort of developers on accessibility who haven't thought of it. But we also have to kind of better train and equip, existing developers, right? We're almost playing catch up here in accessibility land on this, who haven't kind of thought about this before. And certainly for a large organization, right, we struggle with our developers often are so far removed from our customers. So I had this experience for 2 minutes. I'll kind of tell you this story. And how it goes is that we got a complaint a few weeks back from a customer. It was a retired doctor, retired GP, and he was struggling, coming to terms with sight loss. He'd lost most of his sight very suddenly. Coming to terms with being dependent on other people, family members, to manage his finances, and coming to terms with trying to figure out all this, how to use tech, how to use assistive tech. Just overwhelmed. So, I went out, spent some time with him, showing him how he could, use a tablet still, how he could email friends, how he could video call, shall we say, his grandchildren, and how he could kind of use our Barclays app, zooming up and speaking aloud to still manage his money, to see his balance, to make payments. And it was really moving, and at the end of it, he got up and hugged me, and he said, "I'm so proud of Barclays, of the accessibility efforts. I had no idea this existed. The work we've done today, it's urgent, it's important, it really matters. Please tell the teams who build this, it matters." And a lot of my time is really just spent doing that, conveying that back to some of our developers, offshore teams that don't quite feel and face that that feedback, the wow moments when we get it right and the pain points when we don't. So really, really important how we can kind of close that digital divide of people building stuff and people using stuff.
Great point, Paul. Debra, did you have a point before we close?
I have a point, and I have a question, and it's a hard question.
Great.
So I'll just tell you that right away.
Go on.
And this question is for Paul, and it's for all three of you. But these are the. It's so wonderful to be global and to hear what's happening all over the world. It's very helpful for me as I bring it back to the country that I love being part of, the United States. But the complaints that I keep hearing from our corporations, and I understand that we are confusing our corporations by all the litigation, but at the same time, if you would make your things accessible, we'd stop suing you. But this is what I'm hearing from the U.S. corporations, that it's very, very hard to make a very large global corporation accessible, and that the accessibility experts in the United States don't really understand the complexity of what these large global companies have to get their hands around. And so I hear often that they're doing everything the accessibility community in the United States is telling them to do, and yet they're still getting sued. So I was just wondering, Paul and Neil, especially in the two roles that you play, if you wouldn't mind giving some of our U.S. corporations just a little advice. I know that we're doing other good things, like Neil mentioned in the window, our chat window, to remind the audience of the efforts that are being made with the IAAP certifications on procurement and leadership. All those things help, but what do you say to the corporations, and both of your firms are in the United States, of how to truly get your hands around it? Because it just seems like there's more progress being made in your side of the pond than ours. So I was just wondering if you would care to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for accessibility, motives matter, and I know internally, we survey thousands of our colleagues annually across the world, and we ask them, why do you bother with accessibility? And for me, it's really encouraging to see that this kind of, because legally in compliance you have to, has now been overtaken by, well, actually commercially, it makes good business sense. We have more happier customers. So I think that kind of business benefit trumping the legal and compliance risk. I do appreciate, Debra, that many US corporates, for example, they're coming to this journey because they've kind of, what's the word, been,
beaten?
Yeah. I wasn't quite sure how to say it politely, but sort of surprise. Your service, what you're selling, just doesn't work for me and a certain segment like me. So I think it's a wake-up call, and because of that, they're quite reluctant of, I'm having to do this because because of the kind of legal drive, and I don't really see why, and I need to sort of pay some experts that may or may not end up to be experts and give me the advice or tweak my site to what it needs to be. So I think, because of that, people can do all the things that they've been told to do and it still doesn't quite work. But what's driving them is often the sort of, the wrong motives to start with. And I think the more organizations can actually get out there, and we were saying just before we started about, there seems to be a very small number of organizations of inclusive brands that have got great stories to tell about, we did a, hiring program here for certain impairment groups, for example, or maybe, we did some new product or, Tommy Hilfiger, for example, or Microsoft's Xbox controller. They are great stories in themselves, but they are still pockets of progress, right? And I guess the more organizations can do more in this space and actually demonstrate the kind of, we often talk about the return on investment, but bluntly, it's demonstrating the benefits that this brings by doing a bit more around accessibility, adds huge amounts of value. I mean, we see it as Barclays, as a brand, but it's kind of how you tell that story to others that's really important. And I know, Neil, you're involved in lots of stuff around organizations. How do they measure it? All these kind of environmental, social governance, ESG type stuff. And there's various indices about whether we're looking at disability indexes and D&I in general. But I think there's, going to be a bit more focus. We've got some of the gender reporting happening. And I suspect over the coming few years, we'll have more reporting across other diversity inclusion dimensions. So there will be a more focus, and hopefully people able to measure and show the value of accessibility. And let's not forget, right, Debra, there's some great benchmarking tools. So organizations that want to do this are being told that they have to do this, of where to start, like the accessibility maturity model, great free resource out there. Neil, anything to add?
Yeah, so I kind of think sometimes, doing accessibility in a large corporation is a bit like pushing water uphill. It's quite difficult unless you have a wheelbarrow. Then you can fill it with water and get most of it up the hill. So I think every good accessibility person in a corporate should have a wheelbarrow. But in all seriousness, I think that there's an element of persistence here. These things take time. Big organizations, and as a result, that change is going to be slow, but it's inexorable, because once you've started, it doesn't go backwards. So I think the thing to remember is that actually these changes are tangible. We've seen the change in your organization. We're changing ours, and that makes a real difference. And we can evidence that. We can use the benchmarking tools, etc. So it's really to sort of not lose heart. Because you will eventually bring people around. And we've seen this within our own organization too. So we had people that were responsible for our internal communications tools, and there was resistance. And now they're the best example we have of inclusive design and accessible, agile processes that we have in our organization, so that people can change. So now we're pretty much at the end of our time. Thank you very much again for a great interview. It's really great that you're continuing to support us. We really appreciate all of the work that Barclays does and the support that you give to AXSChat and the wider community. Thank you also to our other supporters, Microlink and MyClearText, for providing such wonderfully clear captions. We can't wait to have you on Twitter on Tuesday. Thank you very much, Paul.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.